Welcome to our program, Colin Sweet and Mark Toth.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for having us back on the show.
Daniel, thank you.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin declared a one-day ceasefire in Ukraine, which lasted not so much time, not more than 30 hours. Russia has violated the ceasefire more than 3,000 times, according to President Zelensky. However, Putin did not extend this ceasefire regime despite many statements from Western leaders and President Zelensky. Ukrainian president proposed to extend ceasefire in the air for at least another 30 days. However, Putin rejected this offer and did not extend even his so-called self-declared ceasefire. Colin Sweet, I would like to begin with you. How do you see the main reasons behind these decisions, both political and military one?
Well, first of all, the ceasefire wasn't a ceasefire. Look, over the weekend, another 2,800 Russian soldiers were casualties of the attacks that they continued to put on Ukrainian defenders. And it doesn't count all the drones and ballistic missiles that occurred, strikes that occurred in Ukrainian cities over the weekend too. So it wasn't a ceasefire. It's all propaganda. He puts it out there like, I am doing all this to propose peace, but Ukraine isn't supporting me, or Ukraine isn't falling in line. It's purely for propaganda matters while he continues to attack. So there's always an element of truth, but never the entire truth. And the truth is the attacks continue.
And from a military perspective, there is an interesting opinion which was made, this point was made by Sean Bell, Sky News military analyst. Russia used the ceasefire to redeploy 50,000 troops from the Kursk region of Russia to the Donbas region. Do you feel that Russia used this time to regroup its forces and to prepare for another attacks deep inside Ukraine?
Well, that's always one of the reasons why you have a ceasefire, is to buy time to reconstitute, to reorganize, and to move forces from one area to another. So 50,000 forces moving from one region to another is a large footprint, and it's easily seen. The ability, though, by Ukraine to interdict those forces as they're moving is something that has been restricted by the inability of them to strike them with some precision deep strike fires. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he's using that time to reposition forces, particularly in the Donbass, where he's losing, by the way.
And Mark, what is your take on this self-declared ceasefire in Ukraine? Do you feel that Vladimir Putin is trying to do all what he can just to stay in this negotiations game, just to try to demonstrate Trump that he's serious about making progress in a peace deal, but just to buy more time for his army to gain more land? So how do you see the main reasons why Vladimir Putin made this decision on one-day ceasefire, 30 hours of ceasefire?
Daniel, it's certainly multifaceted in terms of what Putin is trying to pull off here. My first reaction to it was to go back to February of 2022, where Putin kept saying he was not going to invade Ukraine. And we saw what that was. That was just disinformation, and while his troops prepared to do just that, invade Ukraine from multiple points, and almost made it to Kiev. But thankfully, for the valiant defense of the Ukrainian armed forces, didn't get there and was ultimately pushed back into the Donbass, and then further south, obviously, into Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. So from that standpoint, I do think it's cover. I think that's the most logical explanation for what we're seeing. Some of it is negotiating posture. I think he's learned from Trump that at least in the U.S. right now, there's currency in line in terms of the assessment of the situation. And so to be able to come out and say on Easter that he was going to have the ceasefire, he probably thought he was buying some PR brownie points amongst Trump's core supporters and people that are peace activists around the world. But it's all kabuki theater, right? None of us are seeing through that are paying close attention to what was actually happening on the battlefield. And Judd surveyed that, exactly correct. You had the 2,500 plus casualties of Russian soldiers over these 3 days of the Holy Weekend. And nothing much abated. Yes, there seemed to be some diminution of the aerial attacks, but they started up again. At the very beginning of the ceasefire, we saw continued assaults against Ukrainian civilian targets. At the very end, those resumed as well. So it really wasn't much of a ceasefire, except in Putin's mind, except in Putin's marketing efforts to sell it that way. But I think there's something deeper and darker behind this. As John, as I've been warning, Putin is certainly going to try to do some kind of spring or summer offensive. The movement of these troops, if that's accurate, is indicative of that. And I'd only add, that's why I think it's imperative as Friedrich Merz's government takes hold in the next 2 weeks in Germany, is that Berlin get these 140 Taurus missiles that he's promising to Ukraine so that they can begin to interdict these troops before, as John often mentions on your program, they're able to confront Ukrainian forces on the ground.
And also, let's cover this Trump's reaction to the ceasefire. U.S. President Donald Trump says that he hopes for a ceasefire deal, that a ceasefire deal could be reached this week. And also, do you feel that President Trump is buying this one-day ceasefire from Putin? Will he believe that Putin is ready to make real progress toward ending this war?
If that's for me, quickly, I'd argue that Trump is just using this as a marketing opportunity. He doesn't believe in the ceasefire. He's just recognizing that it plays to his favor to argue that he's trying to bring about peace. But I think Trump, once again, as he's consistently been since he's taken office, has been naive about the realities on the ground. He's naive about the geopolitical realities that are facing Ukraine, that Ukraine's not going to roll over and die here. Ukraine's not willing at this point to permanently give up territory, which is a big piece of this proposed ceasefire, at least as we're finding out in leaks. For instance, the U.S. recognizing, which would be terrible under international law, a terrible precedent to set, but recognizing Russian sovereignty over Crimea. And so I think what we're seeing here is that Trump is trying to do what he's tried to do all along, convince everyone that a peace deal is around the corner. But in reality, it's a lot harder to get that done. And he's just nowhere close to that. He claimed he'd have this solved in 100 days. I get it. There was some hyperbole behind that. But I'm not optimistic that we've seen enough movement, especially with recent comments from your president, Volodymyr Zelensky, that we're anywhere close to Ukraine and Russia being on the same page. Ukraine is intent on maintaining its sovereignty, defending its territories, and Putin is intent on getting what he wants, which in my mind is still all of Ukraine.
Hey, Daniel, let me add a couple points to what Mark just said.
John.
Well, this current peace proposal only addresses Crimea and the introduction of NATO into or Ukraine into NATO. What it doesn't address, and what they're going to have to address eventually, is the 4 illegally annexed territories, war crimes prosecution, restitution for damages inflicted upon Ukraine, security guarantees, the return of prisoners of war and those children that were kidnapped over the last 3.5+ years. And it doesn't recognize the fact that by submitting or by giving Crimea to Russia, that you have given control over all the Black Sea, including the port of Odessa, to Russia. So I don't understand what the Trump administration is doing. Look, those 2 points are just 2 points. It doesn't address the other 8. And oh, by the way, there's the state of Moldova, too. So what happens with Moldova when this all takes place as well?
And Mark, John just mentioned about, and you just mentioned about this proposal to recognize Crimea as a Russian territory. Mark, don't you think that Trump's administration is making too many concessions to the Russian side right now?
Absolutely, Daniel. I mean, Zelensky said it himself. He said, Witkov has no mandate from the Ukrainians to be talking about ceding Ukrainian territory. So to the extent that Ukraine's being excluded from those discussions, it's just madness. And for reasons, and John was fantastic to bring all of those points up, for strategic reasons in the Black Sea, to cede that port, to create that, to solidify that land bridge between Crimea that extends back into the Donbass, which helps protect and creates redundancy to the Kerch Bridge, to allow the Russian Navy to return to Crimea, to the as well as the Sea of Azov, ultimately, at some point in time, if they're allowed to reset, let's say the ceasefire comes into play, let's say it even results in a temporary peace treaty between the two, it only, in the long run, strengthens Russia strategically in the area. And as John rightly pointed out, then you get into a question of dominoes. And if they start to fall, what happens in Transnistria? Which there's been machinations about potentially breaking away from Russian domination and returning back to Moldova. What happens to Moldova? What's the end result in Georgia to the south? A lot of things that become problematic. Certainly, one other example in terms of the Black Sea, if you allow the Russian Navy once again to dominate it, then what becomes of all of these rare earth minerals that Trump wants to have this deal done with in terms of exporting them? Because now suddenly you're subjecting yourself to a Russian naval blockade, and the U.S. can't easily put naval forces in there. And if they can, if they do, they can't as easily protect them. It's a locked off sea. So, for all those reasons, it's just a bad idea. Ukraine ought to hold firm on this. If Trump's unwilling to see the light on this and realize that it's just bad geopolitically for Ukraine and for Europe, then Zelensky needs to be turning hard and fast to his European partners and saying, we need a solution because Washington's not going to give us one.
And Mark, what is your take on the recent conversations between Steve Witkov and Russian dictator Putin? I'm confident that you saw this video when Witkov was placing his hand on heart when visiting and speaking with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Do you feel that Witkov has become a close friend of Putin?
I think it's more than a fair question, and a couple of angles to this. First and foremost, as John and I wrote, I believe it was in The Hill, potentially also in the Kiev Post, we wrote about how Steve Witkov is over-identifying with his enemy. And that's a bad place to be if you're the lead negotiator. He needs to be seeing Putin with clear eyes, and he's not. He's fawning over him. The placement of the heart was embarrassing to me as an American. This is a man who, upwards now of 1 million people, more if you count both sides, has caused casualties, deaths, injuries, etc., in this war. And this is not someone that Witkov should be out there saying, oh, I like the guy, he's a good guy, we can do business with him and the like. In my mind, Putin ranks up there amongst the worst of evil dictators around the world because he's willing to spend innocent lives in chase of an illegal action, in this case, which was the invasion of Ukraine. So for Witkov to be doing that is crazy. Now, I will add, it was interesting when John and I wrote 2 articles. They were kind of parallel articles last week. One in The Hill where we were talking about the bumbling qualities, if you will, of Witkov with respect to negotiating nuclear disarmament in Iran, as well as Witkov's bumbling of the situation in Ukraine in terms of conceding territories and conceding points. John and I were kind of on the same page. We both cocked up with these 2 articles, and we basically admired each other without talking to each other first. So from that standpoint, I think, and it'd be interesting to get John's take, both of us simply believe that as long as Witkov is in the picture, we're not serious about really getting to an end state here in terms of negotiations. Witkov is an economics guy. He's a former commercial real estate developer in New York. In my mind, he's not looking for peace. He's looking for future funding deals for himself. That's why you see him dealing with the Qataris and the implications of that for the Iranian side. That's why I think you're seeing him deal with Putin and thinking that that's going to open up Russian investment in his projects, commercial real estate projects around the world. None of it good. John?
One of the points that I took away from one of the interviews that Witkov provided was he referred to his interactions with Putin as creating compelling commercial opportunities, which for Mark and I means this is about business. This is about the United States and Russian relationships. It had nothing to do with Ukraine. As a matter of fact, Ukraine's simply in the way because they continue to resist. These negotiations have nothing to do with stopping Russia from attacking. They have everything to do with stopping Ukraine from resisting. So the fighting stops so that the other 2 countries can get involved in commercial business. And that's disappointing. The other point that Mark made is that, again, with respect to Witkov negotiating Iran and Russia, we don't know what goes behind closed doors, but I'm confident to some degree that Russia is leaning in on the United States to ease off of Iran, because Iran's one of the principal providers for drones and in some cases ballistic missiles to Russia, so they can continue their attacks against Ukraine. So the two are intermixed, and the Trump administration needs to divide them. Okay, they need to go into a different direction. I think that's going to begin first with relieving Witkov of his duties and putting in some people who understand Russian military, Russian history, as opposed to business. The business transaction course of action simply isn't working.
John, let's cover also another developing news today. Another scandal regarding Pete Haxet, U.S. Secretary of Defense. According to CNN, Haxet has created another chat in Signal where he shared war plans with his wife, lawyer, and other members of this chat. How do you assess this development from a standpoint of U.S. national security?
I see it again as what it was with the first Signal issue, is that Pete Haxet is discussing classified information, or if you don't want to call it classified, at least sensitive. And in the world of the military, we call that OPSEC, operational security. So therefore, it is a security violation. And to be talking about that in a chat group on a non-government platform with people who are not in the government is clearly, from my perspective, a security violation, or at a minimum, an OPSEC violation. And look, and 4 people now have been relieved of their duties in the Pentagon because of leaks. But one of those 4 has not been Pete Haxet. He's a prior service Army officer. I don't know if he retired, but he left the service as a reservist, I think, as a major. He knows better than this. He understands this. He has been trained on how to protect information, and yet he continues to devolve classified or sensitive information over signal channels to people who do not have access to that information. So it continues to be a problem. Somebody's going to have to reel him in.
And Mark, what is your take on that? What are the political consequences of this? Another breaking news from the United States, and what are the chances of Pete Haxet being fired by Donald Trump?
It's certainly what the media is gunning for, is to get him fired. Certainly, I think one could argue, and John would know this better than me, the Pentagon seems to be pretty united in pushing back against Haxet. When you have this widespread of, well, quote unquote, leaking, et cetera, there's things going on internally that just are saying, look, we don't agree with his leadership. Unfortunately, yet this morning, the press secretary for President Trump came out and basically said, look, this is expected. He's changing the guard, if you will, at the Pentagon. This is all infighting, and basically intimated that Trump is still standing by him. At some point, though, I think for Haxet to fall, it's going to take Republicans turning on him. It's going to take leadership in the House, leadership in the Senate, meaning Republican leadership, to get that done. But right now, it seems like this is a guy with 9 lives who keeps, wasting them on foolish stuff. I know John and I, John is a retired officer. We're careful about classified information to make sure that I never discuss it with him inadvertently. We're always, making sure that we don't delve into that in the articles that we write, et cetera. And if we're doing that and we're not privy to any current classified information, if we take those kind of great steps, it's disappointing to see that Haxet himself isn't. The idea that he would be discussing classified information with his wife and sending info like that, and then basically lying about it, that, oh, this wasn't classified, that wasn't classified. I'm sorry. I think any average person could see that if you're naming assets being used, if you're naming targets, if you're mentioning that there's a high-value target as there was in the Houthis attacks, and you're mentioning timing, et cetera, you're giving away that you're going after someone. That would tell anyone if you're a high-value target in Yemen, move quickly because your location may have been disclosed. All of that's classified information and relates to, as John pointed out so well, operational security. So politically, I hope it hangs him at some point, and I mean that proverbially, not literally. I don't think he's well suited to being the Secretary of Defense. You need someone more competent of that, someone with a military background that can see the big picture, and I don't think Haxet can.
And Mark, final topic for us, global trade war. What is your? I just wanted to ask you about the latest decision in this tariffs war. What is your assessment of the current situation there, also regarding exemptions from tariffs which were imposed by President Trump?
We're still kind of in a nonsensical world in terms of the tariffs. None of it makes rational sense from an economist standpoint. It really is. It's like Alice going down the rabbit hole into this different kind of world where Trump is trying to put on a brave face. He's trying to claim that this is good. And while, look, there are some elements to what he's saying that I think are important. The idea that there needs to be certain industries returned to the U.S. that relate to national security is a good thing. The idea that the U.S. should be extracting as well as processing its own rare earth minerals is a good thing. Because we're seeing right now with 7 of those being denied, yttrium being one of them, which is key, for instance, in jet manufacturing engines so that the blades don't melt in flight. All of that's good, but there doesn't seem to have been an overall plan. He wasn't anticipating the market pushback. He didn't see the bond markets melting down the way that they were doing. Some of that began with some Japanese sell-off. He hasn't coordinated enough with U.S. allies, and I haven't seen any real steps of it. Now, we see some cosmetic PR work being done here that, 50 some odd deals are currently being done, and we're having these kind of discussions. That's been enough to stabilize the markets for now. But again, and unless he concedes, China has come to play here. And right now, the way Trump has handled his hand by alienating allies, by roiling the markets, et cetera, he's put himself in a bad negotiating position with China, because that's the heart and soul of this negotiation process, is what does that relationship look like in the long run. So from this standpoint, I think we're kind of stuck in some quicksand of Trump's own making. And the military implications of that, I think, are significant because it affects what the U.S. can do militarily. And John can speak better to that than me.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things. The first thing I add is we didn't think through cause and effect, okay? In the military, we call it wargaming. What's the action? What's the reaction? What's the counter-reaction? And I don't think any of that was thought through. I think the actions were brought upon emotion and decisions made in the moment. And we didn't think about the reaction and our counter-reaction. So we're dealing with that. But one of the things that's occurred is trust in the United States from individual countries, but also our fellow alliances that we belong to is if we're going to be treated like this, can we trust the United States down the road? Because right now, the United States is put it on the face of a transactional type of business where conditions change, transactions change, as opposed to agreements, long-term agreements. So it doesn't provide stability and national security, I don't believe, and it's not very helpful. And it has to reach out to our allies to provide some assurances. And maybe they are behind closed doors, but at the surface level, the way it's being reported by all media, not just the left or the right, we have problems right now.
Thank you, Colonel Sweet and Mark Toth, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for having us back on.
Thanks, Daniel. Stay strong.